Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex, meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations, we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for girls and women.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Red Light Exposé. My name is Xiangyu, and this episode was originally aired on my podcast called Strait Talk with Xiangyu. I'm a podcast host and political commentator mostly focused on the history and current events spanning across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. This particular episode goes over the very dark history of the military brothel system set up by the Kuomintang, or KMT, in 1950, shortly after they had lost control of the Chinese mainland in the Chinese Civil War. And these brothels were in operation until the 1970s on Taiwan Island and until 1992 in Kinmen, which is a Taipei-controlled group of islands on the mainland side of the Taiwan Strait. I reached out to Andrea and Elly to speak with me on this subject because I wanted to help my audience understand how the horrors of this particular history are quite universal and continue to exist in the modern day. And for the audience of Red Light Exposé, hopefully this episode can serve as a useful case study on how legalization and regulation do not fix the problems inherent in the sex industry. Over here in Taiwan, it seems very obvious that for the longest time, the approach wasn't really talking about how do we protect women or get them out of this trade. It was more like, well, how do we either just get rid of the sex trade or how do we regulate it? The legal and regulated sex trade in Taiwan began in 1895 when Taiwan became a Japanese colony. Now, before then, we were part of the Qing Empire and they were kind of just laissez-faire about it. It wasn't regulated. But when the Japanese came, they were like, oh, well, we can regulate it, tax it, and then create like red light districts. I think the fact that it became legal set a precedence because in 1945, when Taiwan was returned to China, the KMT came, and for a while they were like, okay, let's try to just get rid of the sex trade. But it was kind of, we don't want it to exist. It's not like we want to really save the women that are involved in it. And as you can see, 5 years later in 1950, they create the military brothel system. And while military brothels in Taiwan serve as a case study, it's important to note that this system wasn't entirely unique to the KMT. I know, Elly, you've done extensive research on the connections between the military and the sex trade globally. So could you please share some insights on the trends and correlations between military forces and prostitution around the world?
I'm not a historian.
Past and
I
present,
just read what historians write, right? I read their books and their studies, and I will send along some sources so people can double check some of the stuff I've said and find out more. The connection between military and prostitution, it goes way back, right? The first records that we have of systematic prostitution is in ancient Mesopotamia, which was a militaristic society. So people often say, yeah, prostitution is the oldest profession. And we're like, no, it's an old form of slavery. It comes with slave societies, land ownership, hierarchies, kingdoms, militaries, right? You can trace it throughout the history of empire, the Romans, and all the different, many, many different types of kingdoms and duchies and militaries of various sizes. There is just a long, long history of doing that, especially to conquered people, but also with their own population, because you have all these young men away from home. And, well, one central patriarchal idea that we as feminists fight is that men have a right to sex. And that right to sex is so strong that even when men are what I think we all think is some of the worst thing about being a man in patriarchy is you might have to go to war. But we still think that sex is so important. It's like close to like food or shelter in the level of infrastructure that a lot of armies have dedicated to making sure to provide men with women. I'm not as familiar with these like very, very ancient examples, but I can say a little bit more obviously about the history of my own country. Germany. And we don't like to talk about that today because then we'd have to question why we still have so many illegal brothels now. Because one era of ours where brothels were really, really in abundance and were state-controlled and state-managed and state-established a lot of the time is the Nazi era. So the Nazis believed, and I can say this ideology, again, it will be the same for other armies. That's also what the Japanese believed about their military brothels. We need brothels because men have a right to sex. Men will become uneasy and they might become a danger to the local population. So we got to separate the civilians from the women who are kind of made for sex, the prostitutes, that dehumanization and othering of women that you place in the brothels. It'll calm these men down. It'll also reward them because they're frustrated and maybe scared. This will calm them down. When we have military-controlled brothels, we can supposedly stop the spread of STIs because we know all these soldiers who were getting all these STIs from all kinds of sexual activities, consensual and non-consensual. They have the idea that they can kind of enforce mandatory testing on the women. They're usually testing the women, not the men, though sometimes also the men. And also homophobia. They were the men are going to start sleeping with each other if we don't provide women, which today we think is ridiculous, but that's part of the reasoning, the homophobia of the Nazis, and I think other military leaders who were involved in this. So people often quote Hitler, I think, as saying something very demeaning about women in prostitution and then suggest that the Nazis were against prostitution. But no, they were running a brothel system. There was basically brothels for the average civilian man who was deemed a citizen, brothels for different parts of the military, specialized brothels for the SS, even some concentration camp brothels to motivate workers and to undermine solidarity, forced laborers in the concentration camp to motivate them to, work harder. And of course, interlaced with all this ideas of racial purity where you didn't want to have any race mixing in there as well. So that's another way that brothels are specialized. The women who staff these brothels, and I think it's similar in the Japanese military ones, is some of these women were already in prostitution before the military came along. And the brothel is a place that offers you food. So I can see why a lot of women said, I did this before. How much worse can the military brothels? They were infamous for extreme brutality. The average brothel's already bad. But think traumatized, brutalized, uber macho soldiers. A military brothel is going to be extra awful. So women, they basically, most of the time, couldn't turn men down, couldn't say no to anything, and had to endure upwards of a dozen men per day sometimes. Yeah, again, some of those women were previously in prostitution. Some of those women, they hadn't been, but they went for the food. And then some women were right out kidnapped. When people hear the military brothels, they think all the women were kidnapped. That's not true. But we as feminists wouldn't distinguish between those women. I don't care what her story is and why she's there. She's being raped now, so that's an injustice. I don't care if she has a history in prostitution. That doesn't make her magically tougher, and then this doesn't hurt her body and her mind. But Germany didn't want to talk about that after the end of the Nazi era. Well, we have to consider how many of the G.I. Joes also wanted to exploit women. I'm not aware that there were military, having the upper echelons of the military control the system. I'm not aware that the Americans did that in Germany, but they might have, though. I haven't investigated that in detail, so I want to be careful. But we didn't compensate the survivors of those Nazi brothels. We're still fighting now to have commemorative placards and placement in the concentration camp museums that we still have to remember those women and remember those victims. One thing I do want to highlight, in Germany, you could be arrested by the Nazi state for engaging in prostitution or being presumed to engage in prostitution. Some of those women were just having casual sex, and they were arrested as prostitutes, which classed you as a deviant or an antisocial. Then you were placed in the concentration camp, and then the state could put you in the concentration camp brothel because that's clearly where you belong. Just think about that insanity. You were imprisoned for prostitution, and then the state traffics you, essentially. That's how nefarious that system was. And that's just one case study. To be fair, I think there probably isn't a military on Earth that hasn't done this to some extent. I think it does matter whether it's endorsed by the generals and the people at the top like it was in Germany, and I don't think every military has done that. I think there are a lot of informal networks today when it's kind of frowned upon. I don't know, the American recreation stations, you wouldn't call it a brothel, but a lot of the times it was, right? And you probably know more about this or can tell us more. So you might have that version or have it more on an even more word of mouth and informal scale where the soldiers organized that among themselves. And one very depressing example that's not that long ago is during the Kosovo War. There's a Romanian-German journalist, Inge Bell. She's written about this extensively, and I can link some of her work. So that's the modern German army that we're talking about, the Bundeswehr, who were put there as peacekeeping troops, who were setting up brothels, including at times exploiting minors, raping minors. Just imagine if that's your peacekeepers, what is that like for women and girls in conflict, right? So again, I would say there are layers to this, as in how involved are the people in power in setting up brothel systems. But I think we would be naive to say that there's any like ethical army out there where this doesn't happen at all. If you dig into the history, which of course no nation wants you to look at that sordid stuff, and when you do it, there's all this victim blaming. I'll just quickly mention this. I have tweeted about the so-called comfort women, like the systematic sexual exploitation of women across Southeast Asia by the Japanese army. And you get all these victim blamers, these Japanese nationalists that come along and say those women wanted to be there.
I hate them.
Yeah. Those women wanted to be there. Those were all consensual prostitutes. Like, we're really trying to fight the idea throughout in history, like from Mesopotamia to today, that there are these women who have a special constitution. Their body and their mind can just take man after man after man after man doing what he wants. She'll be okay. She can take it. Because all of those systems, all the various brothel systems, all depend on that idea of creating that woman who is like a born sex machine that we think is misogynistic and just needs to die.
Oh, that reminds me, like, there are some Japanese nationalists, like ultra right wings, who will say, like, bring up examples of specific, like, Korean or Chinese so-called comfort women who got rich during that time and said, well, see, we compensated them, we gave them a lot of money, they wanted to do it, it was great. But also so many parallels between the military brothels, like what you said with the Nazis and what the KMT ran after they lost the mainland and retreated to Taiwan. So much of the information I'm about to present comes from Liao. He passed away a few years ago. He's a writer, political dissident, political prisoner, commentator, and at one point, he became a legislator. During his military service in, I believe, 1959, 1960, around that time, he conducted on-the-ground research while serving, as a conscript. In 1949, the Kuomintang lost the Chinese Civil War to the Communist Party of China on the mainland. Now, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the KMT, retreated to Taiwan, which was the last major part of China not under communist control, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Now, in his mind, the Civil War did not end. It was just a temporary setback. And the plan was, okay, we're going to launch a successful counterattack and take back the mainland. So these soldiers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers that came to Taiwan with him, weren't allowed to be discharged. Now, these soldiers, understandably, were very demoralized and they just wanted to go home to the mainland. So the KMT kind of kept them under control by promising a triumphant return to the mainland very soon. But at the same time, they banned these soldiers from marrying. Now, one of the reasons is financial constraints, because the KMT did not want to support more military dependence. And they also had the belief that marriage would decrease combat readiness. And potentially, there were concerns that these soldiers from the mainland marrying local Taiwanese women would weaken their resolve to fight for their return to the mainland. And then there was also the argument of maintaining social stability, because there was an influx of hundreds of thousands of single men from the mainland, but there was no similar influx of single women. And if a bunch of men from the mainland entered the dating pool in Taiwan and competed with local men for women, it could have caused social and therefore political instability and threatened Chiang Kai-shek's rule over the territory he had left. And then there's also the reality that due to the meager pay of the soldiers, even if they were allowed to get married, it would have been very unrealistic for them to start and support families. Now, the KMT recognized the human need for connection and intimacy, but it reduced connection and intimacy to the act of sexual intercourse, all while essentially creating conditions that prevented these soldiers from forming genuine connections with women. So with their reductive understanding, the KMT believed that providing cheap, readily available access to sex would alleviate these soldiers' loneliness. And so with Chiang Kai-shek's approval, a network of extremely low-priced brothels exclusively for the military was established in 1950, and all military bases had a brothel next to them. Now, these brothels were officially called 特约茶室, which translates to special contract tea houses. And they were commonly referred to by soldiers as 军中乐园, or military paradise, or paradise of military. There's actually a movie that came out recently about one of these brothels. I haven't seen it yet, but that's the title of the movie, Paradise of Military. Now, these were privately owned, but operated under contract, functioning like franchises with military oversight. And maybe you guys can talk a bit later about the contract model and like the military stuff, the connections. Anyways, thankfully, due to grassroots pressure, these brothels were phased out on Taiwan Island in the 1970s, but they remained in place in Jinmen or Kinmen and Mazu until the early 1990s, with the last one closing in 1992. And again, for those unfamiliar, Kinmen and Mazu are two sets of small islands controlled by Taipei, but part of Fujian province located just off of the mainland on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. So far we can see that the justifications for creating military brothels kind of similar to a lot of the justifications, Elly, that you just talked about that the various militaries, including the Nazis, used. It boils down to, meeting the soldiers' needs and ensuring safety through a legal and regulated system. Which brings us to a relevant point, which is how do defenders of the sex trade today justify their positions?
That's a loaded question. All of these questions are such big questions because I think there's so many ways that people defend their involvement in this. And I think a lot of it is rooted in cognitive dissonance, like the refusal to actually admit what is what. And it's much easier to reframe something in your mind that is in your mind serving you as a means to an end. So it's risky, I think, to say it's one thing or another, but there's definitely patterns where people fall into this choice feminism narrative. That's a big one, like what Elly talked about with the victim blaming and going back to the women and saying, well, she chose it, she wanted it, she liked it, she profited from it. That's a huge one, I think, that undermines a lot of the narrative around the dynamic, the power differential between buyer and seller. And I've been very fortunate for 11 years to be involved with our John School here, which is an alternative measures program that stops men from receiving a criminal record for purchasing sex upon their first arrest of it. And one of the questions that we ask the men, and we've had thousands of men come through this program, we ask them, why were you buying sex? Like, take us into your mind at the time. And probably the top answer that we receive from buyers is that it's easy, no strings attached sex. So kind of like what you were saying earlier with, just that, let's just give these people that cheap, easy, fast access to sex and it'll just kind of abide them over a little bit. It'll give them a little bit of reprieve. Yeah, pacify it. Thank you. That's the right word. So it's not only just that easy access, no strings attached sex that they say, but a lot of these men also say that they did it because they were lonely and because they were bored. And I always get a little taken aback by that. Like, you're bored, so you go and exploit somebody. But it's that thrill of excitement, I think, and the deviance to it that kind of gives them that high, that dopamine hit of that they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing. It's like the kid that goes and takes the candy that he shouldn't take out of the dish at his house. But I think it also speaks to the bigger issue of the lack of connection that a lot of people have to their community and to their other people in their communities, right? So if you are so lonely and bored and all those things, that's a bigger problem that really we should be addressing, is that lack of connection within our community. So I would say that that's the biggest thing that sex buyers say to us in what I think is a pretty honest setting when they aren't actually in the moment of buying sex. And also another one too is, I'm helping her. And that's a big one too, where they try to justify that they are not a victimizer, but they're actually a helper to that woman. I gave her money. Without my money, she couldn't buy diapers for her children. She couldn't pay her rent. So I'm actually helping her. And another one too is that, well, she was advertising. So again, that goes back to the whole she wanted it. I didn't go up to some random woman and offer her money for sex. I replied to an ad. But I think they can't also understand that that's the very nature of how prostitution works, is that it has to be sold that it is the woman's choice, because anything else, it becomes more obvious, I think, that it is exploitation. So I think that that's part of the problem too, is that we're putting all the onus on the supply side without acknowledging that that woman has to say those things to absolve the man of his guilt, his rightful guilt.
I just wanted to say that none of this is isolated, and the ripple effects are certainly felt, even in something as tiny as the language we use. Like when I was doing research for this episode, I didn't realize how so much slang terms that we use for sex, like sex acts in Chinese, originated from these brothels. For example, the term 打炮, it literally means to fire cannons. We use it to say, oh, did you like have sex with so-and-so? And like nonchalantly, we don't really think about the origins of this phrase. Turns out this originated from the military brothels because sometimes the brothels were called 炮阵地 or artillery positions. And because the brothels were officially called special contract Teahouses, right? Even nowadays, when sex buyers order prostitutes to their places, it's called 外送茶 or tea delivery, like as an allusion to the special contract Teahouses. And I think the public health aspect is very important for all of the reasons you mentioned, but also the question of if these military brothels weren't in place, would so many of these soldiers have considered becoming patrons of the sex trade? And I'm not defending the soldiers who visited the brothels, but I think it's important to recognize that they did so on such a large scale because of the culture surrounding it, and also the fact that you have these men who weren't allowed to marry or return home, and then they were undoubtedly lonely, and then all of a sudden a government comes in and offers them a band-aid solution for their loneliness that did not address the root causes and created new problems for them at the expense of the well-being of the women who fell into the prostitution. At the same time, I really don't think that the problems that these men had could have been solved with prostitution, because the problem wasn't the lack of sex, like you said, it's like lack of community, like social alienation. I mean, these men were deprived of normal lives, and they were brought to Taiwan where they don't have friends or family, and then they were forced to stay in the military and weren't allowed to marry. So is it really that surprising that many of them developed mental health issues? And then some of these mentally ill soldiers who did not receive proper care for mental illness ended up, committing heinous acts of violence. I want to give a few examples. In 1963, there was a man who developed feelings for a 21-year-old prostitute at a brothel in Tainan City, my mom's home city, by the way. And when this prostitute did not reciprocate feelings, he felt that she was avoiding him. And then he visited the brothel again and was told she was no longer working there. So then he paid to spend the night with another prostitute. And then in the morning, when he saw that the prostitute he had feelings for was still working there, he went and killed her with a knife and then proceeded to go downstairs to the office and killed the manager's wife before piling books and magazines onto a sofa and starting a fire. And then in 1964, a 17-year-old prostitute was strangled with a rope at a brothel across from the police station in Xinyi district, Taipei City. And the murderer, while we don't really know his motives, was suspected of committing the act because of unreciprocated feelings. And there were many more stories about soldiers unhappy with life, falling for prostitutes who did not return the feelings, and then committing murder-suicides with the whole, like, if I can't have you, no one can, and then we'll go together mentality. I mean, there's several instances of soldiers going into the brothels, picking the prostitute, having a grenade with them, and then during the act, pulling the pin and sandwiching the grenade between themselves and the prostitute to explode the two of them.
Oh my God.
So, yeah, sorry for the graphic story. It's never easy to talk about, but I want to ask, why is there the argument that visiting prostitutes is so therapeutic for men when these stories are so common all over the world? I mean, you were telling me stories about 50-some women being murdered in Canada. Clearly, whatever problems these men have aren't being solved if they're still very clearly mentally unwell.
Yeah. And that's what I think is the biggest hurdle for us to overcome, because it goes back to what Elly said about this right to sex and this belief that sex is something as important as things that sustain your existence: food, water, shelter, clothing. Don't get us wrong. We understand, it's a very strong primal urge, and it's supposed to be that way for the continuation of humanity. But at the same time, we have to recognize that it has to be rooted in mutuality, because when it's not, that's when we see it become institutionalized. And once it is institutionalized, it does impact both buyer and seller. The problem is whenever we put it on this high level among, food, water, shelter, clothing, then we basically see it become institutionalized because of that mindset that it is such an absolute necessity to people's daily existence. And once you see it institutionalized, that's really where you start to see, a great amount of harm happening. I think Elly and I both probably take a lot of flack because we do empathize to some degree with sex buyers in how they also get captured by this system and this ideology. And there is a lot of people that, want to just say all sex buyers are bad. They're terrible people. They're all predators. They know what they're doing. But what I've really found from 7 years in prostitution and then 11 years of John schools with men is a lot of them do fall prey to this conditioning effect as well. And it's like what you said, where they think that it's going to fix something. It's going to fix that loneliness. It's going to fix their awkwardness. Maybe they'll learn better sexual techniques and stuff like that. But when mutuality is not a key component to the sexual exchange, that's where we start to see that difference, because the guy is being told everything that he wants to hear, right? You're attractive, you're, sexually pleasing me well. We say all those things. Women in prostitution say those things to get the man to ejaculate quickly, to get him out of the body of the woman, right? As quick as possible, get him in, get him out. And people think that that is to earn more money, and sometimes rightfully so it is, because pimps oftentimes give quotas, or women in poverty have to pay things and they have to make a certain amount of money. But it's really to just try to end that encounter as quick as possible, because it's traumatic when it's not welcomed, when it's not authentically mutual. So you're saying all these things to this man, but that's what he's believing in the moment. And then you tie that to an orgasm, which is this dopamine hit and this really intense physical response of the body, like unmatched in many ways. And it creates this bonding effect. And the woman obviously isn't having that because she's just playing the role, but he is there because he actually does find her attractive. He actually does desire the sex with her. So when he's being fed all these narratives that she's using to get him to ejaculate as quick as possible, he truly buys into that. And we've seen that in countless situations. And even myself now, I've been out for 11 years and I still have men that purchased sex from me 15 years ago that are messaging me saying, are you sure you didn't like it? Are you sure that I wasn't someone that you actually desired? Because they're so deep in that Kool-Aid, in that brainwash, because that's what's being fed to them. So, of course, men drive this industry. They benefit from it far more than the women do, but they also are victimized by it. And I think when we start talking about that, that really is quite important, because that does start to frame it more as a public health issue. Just like we said, like it does have larger implications on men, women, and society as a whole.
We want to take a moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the Donate tab. There, you can find ways to financially support us one time or on a monthly basis. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
And so I just quickly want to add, there's a project called Sex Industry Kills that is run by industry abolitionists, some of them survivors, so credit to them for the research. And they published one of the first studies ever into prostitution homicides in the German context. And I also reviewed some of this evidence, not for the study, but like when I was summarizing the study, I was like, I think I need to look at the cases some more myself to add some more information. On my blog, I have a blog post that dives into that, 4 decades of prostitution homicides in Germany. You just find the number one perpetrator is a sex buyer. So that is the only job in the world where you are not only likely to be homicided by your so-called client. I mean, people could argue that maybe possibly like police officers can be by the people who call them and then someone attacks them. Okay, but the police officer is naked and he has a weapon. That makes all the difference, right? And he's not in a sexually compromising situation like the woman in the brothel is. So that whole situation is already inherently vulnerable, right? Sex is vulnerable. That's not a prudish thing to say. It's just an objective truth, especially for women, but also for men emotionally, as we just talked about. Things happen there too. And we just see when you have this culture that tells men over and over, sex is your right, those women are different, those women can take it, those women like you, those women were born like this, and then that illusion is shattered. There are cases of women, for example, laughing when he has erectile dysfunction and then he strangles her, like those kinds of things. And just think about those cases are only some of the recorded homicides. Consider the attempted homicides or the cases that maybe the woman herself doesn't even classify as an attempted homicide because it's just that normal, that an upset customer, so to say, attacks her. Like in the sex trade, you see just the worst possible form of customer is king mentality play out on women's bodies, and homicide is the most extreme expression, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. And so I can totally see, like I said, I think the military brothels are the most brutal. I'd imagine in times of war, that all is upped. But even in times of peace, Germany has been fairly prosperous for a while. The economy does all right. And these are men from, sometimes it's anyone from the homeless man up to the president partaking in this industry. And among the killers, you also find all kinds of backstories. Yeah, some of them are down on their luck. Some of them, they're punishing the woman at the brothel because their girlfriend broke their heart or they lost their job. But there's all kinds of stories. But we as a society, we like to say those are just individual sad cases. Those men were just a little kooky. No, we facilitated that when we dehumanized those women and we turned them into toys. We told those men, yeah, the fantasy is real over and over. And the other thing I quickly want to mention, if you believe that prostitution cures men, one of the worst things, and I also share an article about that you find is there are countries all around the world that are experimenting with psychiatric hospitals and prisons, sending men who are sex offenders, like rapists and child abusers, setting up programs where they practice normal sexuality with women in prostitution. I'm not even kidding. That's a real thing that's happening globally, and there are documented cases of those. That is unfortunately, the natural outgrowth of this is a sex professional. Like, she knows how to handle difficult men. We respect her profession. This is where this has led us, and this has been defended by the German pro-prostitution lobby here. They say, as long as you're upfront with the woman at the brothel, that the person coming in is a convicted sex offender or someone coming from a psychiatric hospital because he's sexually aggressive. As long as you're upfront with who that is and you have a decent security system, why not? She's a professional. Let's do it.
And I just want to add a little story. I know probably, Elly, you've heard this. Xiangyu, I don't know if you heard about it in Canada, but we had a man who was in jail for many years for murdering his wife. And it's now been contested. The Canada Parole Board said that they didn't do this, but all signs point to the fact that they likely did. They told this man, okay, you are now on parole, and we're going to allow you to have sexual relations with women in prostitution, but you are not allowed to have sexual relations with normal, quote unquote, normal women. So this man was going and he was visiting massage parlors, and he actually got banned from this massage parlor. He called one of the women to a hotel, and he had seen her multiple times at a legal brothel, essentially. I believe it was a licensed brothel in Montreal. And he stabbed this woman numerous times to death in a hotel room. And the parole board, like I said, later said, well, we didn't tell him to do that, but all signs point that they did. So, that just goes to show that there's this belief that, like Elly said, some of us are set aside for this intended use, and we are separate from, women of society. So here's this guy, they won't allow him to have normal mutual relationships with women, romantic relationships, but they'll allow him to go relieve his needs, I think was the term, or meet his sexual needs in prostitution. So that woman, how was she to even know? She didn't know, I don't think, his background. And then how is she to defend herself? Who sits in that room with her? Like, who is her bodyguard? So when people talk about this, bring it above ground, license the place, put panic buttons. And Elly and I have done an episode about the fallacies of safety with these approaches. But it really shows that there's no way to defend yourself against a violent man who is sexually entitled that you will ultimately be alone with in a private space, whether that's a room, a car, any of those things. He has an expectation of you. You have to verbally agree to that expectation, right? Again, I like you, you're great, this is wonderful. But you can't lead him on too much, because then if you do, you'll be blamed for having led that man on. And then you're the problem as to why he did that, because you manipulated him, you took advantage of him. So women lose either way in this system. We are the ones that are blamed. It's not about the man that killed the woman. It's about what did she do that made him do that. And so that's the problem in so many ways whenever we talk about bringing this quote unquote above ground, is that it sanctions these attitudes and creates these dynamics between men and women.
Yeah, it sounds just very futile to try to make the sex trade safe through legislation. It's like thinking you can make Jackie Chan stunts safe with regulations in the film industry. It's like, how are you going to make jumping off of a multi-story clock tower safe? I don't know.
Yeah. The harm is inherent, and that's what we need to arrive at as the understanding. That's like step one of the understanding, is that the harm is inherent. And there is, of course, an argument to be said for harm reduction.
But for harm reduction to be like the end-all be-all solution is also just very nihilistic and pessimistic, in my opinion, when I think we ended practices like child labor in the developed world. So why is it so difficult to believe that, this form of exploitation can someday end? We ended chattel slavery. Why can't this end? And I want to quote from your book once again. Women who are coerced, pimped, and trafficked into sexual servitude are largely hidden from public view by the smokescreens of licensing and the sex work lobby. And that's more or less what happened under the system the KMT put in place. And although the women were in these military brothels on free will, it was quite common for these women to have been sold into the brothels by pimps and forced to sign contracts. And organized crime was heavily involved in running these legal brothels, which is why these brothels were staffed by thugs who'd often subject the women to corporal punishment for failing to meet quotas. And I'm about to share a vivid description of one military brothel as documented by Liao, the guy I mentioned earlier, based on the research that he did when he was doing his military service. He would go in during his afternoon breaks instead of taking a nap. And to really illustrate how terrible the conditions at these brothels were, one day he was sitting at the billiards area of the brothel copying down the rules on the wall, and a prostitute approached him and she begged him to buy a ticket to spend time with her. And he told her that he wasn't there for services. And then when he told her that, she lifted her skirt to reveal bruises on her leg and begged him to buy a ticket even if he's not looking for sex, and told him that she got those bruises because she did not meet her quota. So Liao did buy a ticket and he thought that it was the end of it. But then after he bought the ticket, she asked him to at least go through the motions of walking into the room with her, even if he wasn't going to have sex, because she was scared that if management didn't see him going in with her, they'd accuse her of angering a paying customer. And I just want to show real quick. So I talked about the billiards area. Now, every single military brothel probably looked different, but they were probably very similar as well. This was the one next to the military base where he served. So when you first enter the one-story building through a door right in the middle, you walk into a billiards room with pool tables to your left and the right. On the opposite side of the room is an entrance into the brothel area. And once you enter the brothel area, immediately to the left is a clinic, which is there as a formality. And to the right is a thuggish guard to make sure the prostituted women don't escape. And once you walk past the guard, you enter an area with 2 parallel hallways, both with 5 rooms on either side, totaling to 20 rooms. Then the 2 parallel hallways connect at the back, which is the madam's area. And once you enter the billiards room, which is filled with smoke and the sound of chatter, there's a wall with a row of 10 to 20 photos that are 6 inches individually framed and labeled with numbers. Now, some have notes stuck below them saying off work, which usually meant she was on her period. And beneath the wall with the photos, there's a door. And next to the door are where the rules are, like posted on the wall, and then the ticketing station. So when a soldier is ready to enter the brothel area, he purchases a ticket, and then he chooses the prostitute he wants by naming her number. And in this particular brothel, there were 2 classes of prostitutes, one for officers and one for regular soldiers. And the tickets for officers cost, at the time, this was written in 1959 or 1960, 25 Taiwan dollars, while the ones for regular soldiers cost 10. Some brothels had 3 classes for various ranks as opposed to 2. Now, I don't know how to do the conversions for the currency with the time factored in, but today, 30 Taiwan dollars is 1 US dollar. Now, but then like over here, account for inflation and how much things cost back then. The point is, they're still probably very cheap. And the process for getting a prostitute is you buy a ticket. Yeah, a ticket. You don't even pay her cash. You get a ticket from the brothel. I mean, how dehumanizing is that? And then you get your ticket checked and you select the prostitute. You read the rules. You walk in, you begin the session, and then you wash up. And by washing up, I don't mean you shower. There is no plumbing in the individual rooms. The prostitute goes out and gets water in a little bucket, and she brings it back to you, and you just wash off your private areas. And then you get dressed, and then you exit. Each room was more or less the same. You got a simple bed, a makeup table, and dark lighting. And once the soldier enters and closes the door, a red light next to the door turns on, which means a session is going on in that particular room. At the time of this writing, each session is 40 minutes, and a soldier is allowed to ejaculate once. I heard later on, like towards the end of the system, like the sessions weren't like 40 minutes. They were sold in like 7-minute increments. But soldiers want to make full use of the time, while the prostitutes do whatever they can to end the session as soon as possible. And that's where conflicts often arose, because if the prostitute manages to end a session early by getting the soldier to ejaculate, then the remainder of the 40 minutes can be sold under the table, and she keeps all of the money, since management's cut comes from ticket sales. Or it could also be because, like Andrea said, it's traumatizing. They want it to be as quick as possible, but it was a common thing for them to sell the extra time like under the table. So these rules led to soldiers engaging in pretty disgusting practices like applying topical numbing medication to last longer so they could try to get as much of the 40 minutes as possible. And at the same time, these prostitutes would do everything they can to get the soldiers to finish early. And a lot of conflicts arose. And like I mentioned earlier, there's no running water in these rooms. So after a session ends, the prostitute would leave the room with an aluminum basin, fill it up with water, give it to the soldier to wash off his privates. And oftentimes, because everything here was so fast-paced, the prostitutes wouldn't even bother putting on their clothes before heading out because they'd had to take them off for the next session. And it wasn't uncommon that during this process, like soldiers like queuing in the hallway would try to grope them. So it was quite literally a meat market. Can you think of anything more dehumanizing than this? Like, very few. Now, like I said earlier, there were required minimum numbers of sessions for each prostitute, and those who failed to meet the minimum would be punished. And like in the example above, corporal punishment wasn't unheard of. So it wasn't unusual for prostitutes to see like 30 to 40 soldiers a day, especially on paydays and holidays. And if this wasn't clear already, very few of the women entered the military brothels willingly. Many were sold into them by pimps who operated unlicensed brothels on the outside, while others were leased to the brothels by pimps. But of course, on paper, they all signed contracts, so they are there willingly. So, I mean, once again, this sounds very similar to the things that you've talked about, but maybe there are some details about what I just mentioned that are very particular to these special contract tea houses. Do you have any comments?
It's interesting because what you said is like so extremely graphic, and I think that a lot of that stuff still likely exists in more developing nations, and also for sure some developed nations as well. But I know that there was a spray that men would spray on their penises, and then we would, as many of us as possible, try to enforce condom usage on men for even oral sex when we were performing oral sex on them. So they would try everything that they could do to extend that time. And here it's more so an hour, but that's because it's not really in and out. They want like what we call the girlfriend experience. So they want the cuddling and the kissing and, that facade of it being authentic. You can still get like the 15-minute sessions, the quick come and go sort of things, or even 30-minute ones. But typically 1 hour is the norm here. But yeah, a lot of those things, same thing, like as you're walking you're walking one sex buyer to the front door that you've just finished with in the room, and another one is being walked to the room with another woman, and he's ogling you, or he's reaching out or saying, hey, when I'm done with her, I'm going to book with you. The hygiene, whenever you talked about that, the very first massage parlor that I ever operated out of under this woman had a severe mouse infestation. So we would see mouse droppings all along the borders of the walls in the rooms. And the woman refused to spend, I think it was about $800 Canadian to get an exterminator. So instead she went and adopted 2 free cats from a pet humane society. And then of course we got rid of the mice because the cats scared them away, but now nobody took care of these cats. And so they were urinating everywhere. There was strong ammonia in the brothel. They would shred up the vinyl that would wrap the beds. And when we say beds, we didn't really have beds. We had wooden frames that had foam and then were wrapped in a vinyl. So it was kind of like a table, sort of like what you would see as a massage table. And then we would just throw a sheet on top of that. But these cats would rip up the vinyl, so then you'd have the foam exposed, which would have seminal fluid, vaginal secretions, blood, sweat, anything in them. I've seen women who developed ringworm infections, had scabies infections, men who would come with severe herpes outbreaks, and they would just try to say this is irritation from shaving. They really didn't care about our health. You would see men who would masturbate in the shower because thankfully we had showers, so we would try to get the men to take a shower first. A lot of them would refuse it, but they would masturbate in the shower first, and then you would struggle to get them erect again, and then they would blame you for that, and then they'd tell the owner that you weren't working hard enough, quote unquote. So then you would be encouraged to stay longer with that man to ensure that he left happy and had ejaculated. So many problems where it was always about what they call value for money. And they would actually go on these escort review boards, which are still in existence today, where it's literally men going on the internet and ranking women with numerical scales and giving play-by-plays about the sexual acts that they will or won't do, how enthusiastic she was or wasn't. And if you didn't perform well, your reputation would just be obliterated and you would not get any sex buyers. And then if you didn't have enough sex buyers coming in, the owner wouldn't want you at the brothel. So then you'd be driven out of there because you weren't earning money. So it's really this thing of you have to pander to these men, even whenever you're like, this is unjust, I shouldn't have to do this, or you know, he can't ejaculate because he masturbated or sprayed this numbing cream on his penis. They don't care. You know, nobody hears those details. All they hear is this man going to the review boards and saying, I didn't ejaculate with her. She didn't give me the full hour. After 30 minutes of intercourse, she told me she was sore and tired. She asked me to stop. No good value for money. I would not recommend, and I wouldn't repeat. So these women are really, I don't know what the word is, but dependent on these men's approval to then continue getting other men to come and abuse them to receive that monetary gain from it. So again, it just goes back to how this whole system is set up against them, because who's going to believe her whenever it's like, you know, Elly said, customer is king, right? He's always right. It doesn't matter what happened. He has to leave happy.
Yeah. So I also want to mention a few parallels. I'll try and make it quick because there's so many between that military brothel that you described and the modern ones, because they're not that different. They're really not. I mean, Andrea already highlighted so many points. I want to mention most brothels, like the one that you described, they have like a contact area that's usually like a bar room. The bigger ones in Germany all do. Even though he doesn't want to go through the trouble of actually picking up a woman at a bar, having to be like at least a minimum charismatic and appealing to her, he wants the illusion in the brothel. Although we have to say that, I mean, you really have to stretch your brain to not realize this is not a normal bar, because in Germany, some of those brothels, the women are naked. Not just in lingerie, where it was full on naked, still in the awful high heels. And if they find that hard to believe, I have YouTube videos where I'm blurring all the nudity, which wasn't blurred on German TV. I go through a piece of German TV that goes into a brothel like that. And yeah, of course, the men want to feel the goods before they pay. Like that is normal. That still happens. And what you were saying with the pictures on the wall, if that sounds horrible to people, that's just prostitution advertisement. Today, we just do that online. We just do that on the internet. All the women have to upload pornographic or semi-pornographic images of themselves on the escort or brothel sites. That's just how it works. Because the men, they want to filter women. I want a woman who's this type of body, this type of race, this type of hair length, shaven, not shaven, pierced, tattoos, smoker, non-smoker, trans or not trans or whatever. If that sounds appalling, that's just how the industry operates today. I also want to mention those numbers do stand out, 30 to 40 men per day. That is extreme. So I have not often heard that from women in German prostitution, or like 7 minutes. You do get 20 minutes sometimes. You can order 20 or 30 minutes in German brothels. And what we used to have, where we did have women having to endure dozens and dozens and dozens of men per day, we used to have brothels in Germany offering something called a flat rate. And that means the man pays once at the entrance and he can go as many times with as many women as he can physically keep abusing, essentially. It was publicized quite big in the media because there were brothels offering this. Women were queuing outside to use this offer. And the reporters said, well, we spoke to some of the women, and around the afternoon, a lot of the women were just crying because they couldn't take it anymore. And that all happened in a legal system. That all happened while legislators and media and the public watched, essentially. I know people really, really struggle with this. When we speak about this issue, we don't open with this phrase, but if that's not legalized rape, I don't know what is. When women have to keep going, when every part of their being wants to say no, but either because of poverty or the pimp, they have to keep going, how's that not paid rape?
Yeah, and if the man doesn't orgasm, she's often encouraged to give his money back. We would see that as well, too. I experienced that at times where men were so porn sick that they had developed erectile dysfunction and they could not perform without watching porn simultaneously while having sex with us in these brothels. And so if they couldn't perform and ejaculate, they would, call us a scammer. If we didn't show our face in our ads, they would call us bait and switches, meaning like, oh, you appeared to be young, your body looked young, but then your face was older, so you bait and switched me. And I know Elly has found some terms where they call them rip-off cunt. So
that's what the German Johns say, yeah.
Yeah, so there's like all these very graphic terms where the woman has to come to his mind of what the experience will be. And if she falls short of that, then there's this expectation that, again, she has to give the money back or take no money. But mind you, she still has to pay that room rental fee. So, I would have men that would come and have sex with me for an hour straight, very violently, very rough, and they would not ejaculate. And they'd say, well, I want half my money back. And I would say, well, I gave you the full hour of my body. I have to pay however much it was at the time, $40, $50 to the owner of the brothel. I did the things on my end. It's not my issue that you were unable to ejaculate. But that's how they view that value for money, again, going back to that. And then it was, well, she's not good enough, or, she didn't care, she didn't do this, she didn't do that. It's always going back to the woman instead of seeing that this man is in an addiction cycle. And because of that, he's not getting that hit, right? His tolerance is too high, that nothing is stimulating him or taking him over the edge sexually anymore. All that onus is always put on the woman. And then she's the one that bears the brunt of that anger or frustration of the sex buyer.
And I think even before the emergence of sex work ideology in the mainstream, we already saw a lot of this sanitation going on in the form of euphemisms. In this book I read, the same book, he had like a bunch of rules from various brothels copied down by his various friends, and he collected them all. And I'm just choosing from a few of them. And imagine like you walk into a building and these are just listed on the walls. Now, the following 4 rules that I chose that stood out to me were for the prostitutes. The first one was entertainment for soldiers and officers cannot be refused without reason. Number 2 was do not serve officers or soldiers who refuse to use condoms and apply antiseptic ointment. 3, no seeking gifts from officers or soldiers. And 4, no gambling or excessive drinking. So the fact that these rules are written there says a lot about the whole situation. But at the same time, it's using language that sanitizes the situation, like entertainment. And now the following rules are for soldiers and officers. Number 1 is check the health certificate of the server. 2, do not forget to wear a condom and apply antiseptic ointment. 3, insert the penis into the vagina slowly to avoid abrasion. 4, if any symptoms of a sexually transmitted disease occur after entertainment, consult a doctor immediately and do not conceal it. 5, do not forget your duties during entertainment. 6, withdraw quickly upon ejaculation, do not linger. 7, after the act, take 2 to 6 anti-inflammatory tablets orally or inject penicillin. 8, those who are intoxicated are not permitted to purchase entertainment. 9, ticket required for entry, no refunds for purchased tickets. 10, do not discuss military intelligence. 11, those with family in Taiwan are not served. Now this, I guess, wasn't written in all of them. I guess it was written in like 1 or 2 of them. And 12, if service is inadequate, provide feedback to management for improvement. And the purpose of this is like talk to management as opposed to arguing directly with the prostitute. So, I mean, you notice how, like, instead of calling them prostitutes in these rules, they were called 侍应生, which is like waitress or server or attendant. And the sessions, like I mentioned earlier, were called 娱乐 or entertainment. It's not too dissimilar, in my opinion, to how today there are various euphemisms for prostitution, like sex work or escorting. So wouldn't you say that these sorts of euphemisms exist because most people innately know that the commodification of sex eats away at the dignity of all parties involved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think if you said, like, when purchasing a woman, make sure you do this, I think that that would be different. And I think that that's why we really do everything that we can to try to not only debunk labor language, but also just try to not use it. And that is incredibly difficult. Like, it is so hard to not use those terms because they have been just swallowed up by every institution, academia, commonplace society, everybody. Like, if you even say, you know, prostituted woman or woman selling sex, they will say, you need to use the term sex worker, give her her dignity. They can't understand how that's actually very counterintuitive to it for what you said. It's removing that woman as a human and it's putting her into this analogy that she is a worker. It's very destructive, but it's very hard to avoid, like I said, because it has just been completely embedded in all of the language everywhere, even by some abolitionists. And, you know, they're well-intentioned. They think, well, that's me giving dignity to the woman by calling her sex worker because I hear from all these sex work organizations that that's the appropriate term. And I've read academic papers and even abolitionists call her that. So that's what I should call her. But then it has that effect of perpetuating that labor analysis as the core foundation of examining this issue rather than human rights analysis.
There's so much to say about language. I won't give a whole essay because I'll just recommend that we've done an episode about that so people can check that out in our podcast. There is no perfect language, but we give some recommendations and we go into some of the history because people have always wanted to shy away from actually naming it as it is. And at the end of the episode, we do an experiment like Andrea just did. What if we say to buy a woman, or what if we say pay to rape? Then everyone recoils. It just like pops the bubble of the illusion right then and there.
Yeah, like sex buyer, that's an example right there, right? If you said woman buyer or body buyer, that would not only be more accurate because you're not buying sex, you're buying, you know, you're renting the use of somebody for your infliction of sexual acts because it's not mutual. She's not engaging in actual sex with you. It is you as a man conducting sexual acts basically upon her rather than it being an equal exchange. So if you said woman buyer or body buyer or exploitation buyer, something like that, like it, you know, people would be, oh my gosh, they'd be all up in arms, but that's the truth. And that's really what language we should use. But at the same time, people then say it dehumanizes the woman. And then we get back into that autonomy argument around choice feminism. And then it's that push and pull of what is the appropriate language.
All of this was legal that I just mentioned. And what does it say when you have all of these rules just written nonchalantly on the wall with this sanitized language? I mean, if you're a normal person, I feel like if you heard all of those rules, it's just very ridiculous and unimaginable. But this was something that was very normalized for decades. And not only were there rules written on the walls using this sanitized language, since these were military brothels, you also had propaganda slogans that were specific to the military brothels. Like one was a what? 勿谈风月 勿论军情, so do not engage in romance, do not discuss military affairs. Now, the fact that do not engage in romance was even written out in a slogan, what does that say? It means that anything that they tell you not to do has probably happened on more than one occasion. So you have situations of these like men who become infatuated and whatever. And also another one, 尽情娱乐,勿忘军誉. So enjoy yourself to the fullest, but do not forget the military's honor. What honor in the military when you're doing all of this? I mean, you're talking about the government that's continued to claim legitimacy over all of China and the country's honor and how we're going to save our suffering compatriots on the mainland from communism. But imagine yourself to be one of these women in these brothels. All of those slogans, what do they mean? Like, they can't even save the women in the territory that they do have control over. How are they going to save compatriots on the mainland? And one of the first things that was done when the communists took over on the mainland was to address the prostitution issue. Now, was it successful? I mean, for a while it was, but then as market reforms happened and these like income disparity, wealth gaps increased, we saw some of these social ills coming back. But I mean, just compare and contrast. Now, I have 2 newspaper articles and 1 magazine article, all having to do with military brothels. And since there's 3 of us and 3 articles, I was thinking maybe we can each read one. And like I said earlier before our recording, if you need help with names, just let me know. I'll help out. So who would like to read the first one?
I think we settled on you doing that one, didn't we?
Okay, I will do that then. So this was an article written on December 25th, 1960. And the title is, Daughter Escapes with Lover, Father Captures Her with Armed Escort. Adopted Daughter Sold into Prostitution. On the eve of Christmas, in front of the Provincial Women's Association on Guling Street, in our city, meaning Taipei City, several unidentified assailants used a taxi to abduct a couple. The couple shouted for help, and the nearby Criminal Investigation Division of the 7th Police Precinct immediately dispatched officers. They took the couple to the station for protection and captured one suspect, Li Zhigao, who was suspected of unlawful detention. The other assailants had all fled by car. According to the preliminary investigation by the police, this is a case involving a father deceiving his daughter, who was under 15 years old, to work in a contract tea house as a prostitute. A young man assisted the girl in escaping from the situation and came to Taipei to seek help from the Provincial Women's Association to mediate a marriage. However, her father, along with several other assailants, attempted to adopt the girl and her fiancé. The police find the case to be very complicated and are currently continuing their investigation. They are also coordinating with the Pingdong Police Department to apprehend the fugitive assailants. Li Jinlian was born on May 20th, 1946, and is still a young girl under the age of 15, or I guess under the age of 16. She lives at number 8 Huiyao Lane in Pingdong City. According to her cheerful account at the police station, she is the biological daughter of Li Zhigao and has 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Due to her father's severe gambling addiction, the family was left penniless. In 1958, her father sold her to Lin Yuecai at number 10 Xiangyu Lane in Pingdong City to be an adopted daughter. 3 months ago, her adoptive mother forced her to work as a tea house girl at the contract tea house Chunxi in Pingdong, using the excuse of her losing one eye. So I guess the mother lost an eye and needed money for that. In October of this year, her father bought her back for 7,500 new Taiwan dollars. Her father picked her up from her adoptive mother's home under the pretense of going home for a family visit. However, he instead brought her to the home of a man surnamed Zhuang near a contract tea house on Jianguo Road in Pingdong. She stayed at Zhuang's house for a few days, where Zhuang deceived her into thinking she would work as a server at the tea house. After Li arrived at the tea house, her father bought her a suitcase and a 4-tail gold necklace, while Zhuang bought her a watch and some clothing. Upon arriving at the tea house, Zhuang forced her into prostitution, threatening to lock her up if she refused. Li further stated, she was assigned the number 11 at the tea house and was sold there on retrocession day, October 25th of this year. She had a key to a room and shared the room with number 17. Unable to endure the torment, she escaped by car at around 3 a.m. on the 4th of this month and stayed at her boyfriend Guo Shicheng's house for over 10 days. Her boyfriend was willing to help her escape the difficult situation, and she agreed to marry him. However, her ID and other belongings were confiscated at the tea house. On the 16th of this month, she applied to the Provincial Women's Association for mediation. After receiving a notification 2 days ago from the Women's Association to come to Taipei, the couple arrived together yesterday at around 4 p.m. Following the mediation by the Women's Association, her father, Li Zhigao, and 5 or 6 unidentified men forcibly dragged Li and her boyfriend Guo onto a taxi as they left the building. Li desperately shouted for help, prompting her rescue by the 7th Police Precinct. The assailants then fled by car, one of whom was Zhuang. Li's father was arrested by the 7th Police Precinct due to being restrained by Guo. Guo Shicheng, a 25-year-old carpenter from Pingdong, resides at number 91 Gongyong Road in Pingdong City. According to a statement at the police station, his home is near the Chunxi Public Tea House. He met Li Jinlian at the Chunxi Tea House in early October this year. Although Li is young, she is a beautiful, kind, and lovely girl. The two of them had a good relationship. Unexpectedly, on the day of retrocession day, Li was sold to the tea house. According to what he heard from Li's uncle, Li was contracted to the tea house for a year and a half for the price of 13,500 new Taiwan dollars. Her contract was later extended to 2 years, but he does not know the additional compensation. Unable to endure the suffering, Li escaped in the early morning of the 4th of this month and first went to his house for a few days. On the 16th of this month, she applied to the Provincial Women's Association for mediation. The Women's Association notified both parties to attend the mediation on December 24th. The two of them rushed to Taipei 2 days ago. At around 4 p.m. yesterday, following the mediation by the Women's Association, Guo was asked to pay 3,000 new Taiwan dollars to Li Zhigao. Both parties agreed to set a wedding date. Unexpectedly, as they left the Women's Association building, Li Zhigao and several unidentified men arrived in a taxi, intending to forcibly drag them into the taxi and abduct them. They shouted for help, and the nearby 7th Police Precinct quickly dispatched officers to intervene. My guess is this story is not surprising at all to either of you, but it doesn't make it any less gut-wrenching. And one thing I want to point out is the so-called boyfriend sounds to me like he was a sex buyer.
But I just want to ask, where was this published? Is this a serious newspaper or a cheap paper?
Serious newspaper from 1960. Yeah.
So, I mean, the first thing is okay, privacy conventions must have changed because you could not publish that in Germany today. Thank God. You would have to not give addresses and full names, because you can identify those people basically. And just even today, imagine the impact if a story like that about this girl or a young woman was public, how that would haunt her. Oh, there's even a picture. Yeah, getting your picture that, unless it's a famous person, you can't do that in Germany.
Right. I guess standards have really changed.
Thankfully.
It's gut-wrenching to just hear how many people were plying to get at this girl, an underage girl. And I don't know back in 1960 what the laws were there. We look at Andrew Tate and them. I think they were saying in Romania, 15 is the age of consent. And so they were supposedly having sex with 15-year-olds, and it wasn't illegal. But obviously this is trafficking very clearly. It's just sad to hear the adoptive mother is forcing her to try to, cover the cost of her losing one eye. And then she's got other people trying to get at her. I think it just speaks to the realization of how minors are really hot commodities in the market. And everybody always wants to say, well, it's over 18 and stuff like that. But there was a study done, I can't remember, I'd have to look it up now, but they were studying the prostitution population in Thailand, and they found that 40% were children. So when people hear these stories and they kind of think that they're one-offs, they're not, first of all, but they oftentimes don't make the news because what Elly said, there's a lot of privacy concerns around naming exploiters because that will reveal the identity of the minor who has been exploited, and that could stigmatize them and hinder their ability as an adult to then be accepted into mainstream society. So, I think these stories, we have to hear them, but it's very telling of how young teen girls are really just these hot commodities, and people know that the sex buyers will buy them even though they are minors. And that's not to say adult women are not trafficked. Obviously that happens in crazy numbers, tens of millions of women worldwide, but there is a big portion of girls. you know, it really speaks to how the younger women, the teens, are really those that people understand to be so valuable to the sex buyers, that really they don't care. They don't discern if they're buying an adult or a minor.
There's so much to say. I'll try and keep it brief. One of the biggest groups at risk for prostitution as minors and adults are kids, especially girls who grew up in care, who ran away from abusive families or were groomed away from abusive families, which kind of sounds like it happened here. Like, she's surrounded by perpetrators, not just the traffickers. That adult boyfriend, not a boyfriend to me, that's a pedo criminal. One thing I do want to mention, for example, in the United States, there is a lot of talk about trafficking of underage girls. And yet we care when it happens in the brothel. We also care when an adult man is marrying an underage girl, which is still legal in a lot of states in the US and not just there, elsewhere. Like, age of consent laws were fought for by feminists, and then I call them pedo criminals. I don't like to say pedophiles because it's crime, not love. Men who perpetrate violence on kids, in this case, mostly men on girls, but, you know, boy victims exist too. They have a lobby also. Of course they have. And they have, in Germany, been quite successful because our age of consent is actually 14. Thankfully, that's not the minimum age for prostitution, but that had to be clarified in law. So it's actually only been 18 since 2008, I believe. So only in the 00s did we raise that to 18. It was 16 before. And in Switzerland, the minimum age for prostitution was 16 until 2013. So legal trafficking of minors into legal brothels wasn't criminalized that long ago. That's in all of our lifetimes. And the survivors of that, where's their compensation? We love to forget our history of legal child exploitation in all these countries. But just one last point. We were talking about language. The language of sex work is creeping into the area of child sexual exploitation, and we keep seeing child sex worker. And not just in the cheap papers, but in like big government agencies. The government of New Zealand has used that language. Reputable outlets that are even tasked with the protection of children are sometimes now using children in sex work, underage sex worker, minor in sex work, client for the pedo criminal. Right? The man who pays to rape the child is called a client repeatedly. So we need to fight that language for the adults, but also for the minors, because the people who keep saying sex workers for adults and consenting, their language is dripping, dripping, dripping where it really doesn't belong.
And on that note, would you like to begin reading the second article? This article is from November 26, 1964, so not too long after the first one happened, so 4 years apart.
Okay, so Teahouse implements lynchings. Owner, a demon king. Poor girl unable to bear abuse, fled barefoot to Taipei. A young girl unwilling to endure a life of abuse, after several days of exposure to the elements, arrived barefoot in Taipei on the evening of the 24th, wearing only a thin shirt and shorts. She is currently under the protection of a women's organization. I don't know, I already want to comment on the story. I just quickly want to mention the fight for the rights of girls and women in prostitution exists since the first wave of feminism. And women like Josephine Butler are the foremothers of that, who was an activist around that in Great Britain. And back then, it used to be really dangerous to advocate around this because men would protest you. Even if you spoke about the trafficking of girls, protest you, set buildings on fire where you were trying to speak. And so that's way earlier than the 60s. But I'm just saying, okay, so thankfully there is some infrastructure, just like domestic violence shelters. Women's activists were fighting for these girls. So that's the only thing that in all this darkness that stands out to me. Well, somebody cared at least.
I don't want people to end this episode with the conclusion that like, oh, the people over here are so evil or whatever, because we have these types of people in all societies. But I want to point out that it's very important to understand that the system ended also because of the people over here who protested against it and pressured the government to get rid of it.
Exactly. Okay, I'll keep going and try not to interrupt myself every 20 seconds. Yo Adi, who risked her life escaping a fiery pit, told reporters yesterday, looking to save money for her wedding expenses, she began working as a prostitute at a contract tea house in Pingdong in December after being introduced there by her adoptive mother's friend. She initially intended to work for only 3 months and did not expect to lose her freedom immediately upon entering the tea house. Yo Adi said that the tea house owner hired 6 bodyguards, but they never protected the women. On the contrary, their job was to whip and beat them. Yo said the owner required the women to serve at least 20 clients per day. If, during settlement after closing, any of the girls failed to meet the owner's demands, the 6 bodyguards would take turns beating them with baseball bats. When punished each night, they were forced to remove all their clothes. They were not allowed to cry out or scream while being beaten, or they would suffer even more. Yo said that in order to avoid physical torment, every woman in the tea house would force herself to serve clients even when sick, and that they would use any means to get clients. As long as someone passed the tea house, they would do their utmost to drag the person in. Therefore, many nearby residents dared not pass by the tea house after dark. Yo said they worked tirelessly every day to earn money for the owner, but they were only given watery congee, so rice porridge, to eat. Under such conditions of physical abuse and hunger, 2 of the girls have already lost their sanity. On the night of the 18th of this month, Yo could no longer bear it. Seizing an opportunity while serving a client, she climbed over the wall and escaped from the tea house. She sought help from a passerby who, seeing her pitiable state, gave her some money. Fearing she might be caught and taken back to the tea house owner, Yo first took a train and then walked for several days, finally arriving in Taipei. When she arrived in Taipei, she was wearing only a thin shirt and shorts, wandering alone on the streets. Later, a kind-hearted woman found her, gave her some clothes, and took her to a women's organization for protection. Yo told reporters yesterday afternoon that she hopes law enforcement can crack down on the illegal activities of the contract tea house in Pingdong to prevent more girls from suffering.
I want to mention Pingdong is on the southernmost part of Taiwan, and compared to Taipei, especially back then, it was quite impoverished. So both of these stories involve like women from that area. And, you know, the first one, I mean, her father had a gambling addiction, but there was also the factor of extreme poverty. And this was during a time when Taiwan was still a developing economy. So you were poor among poor people.
First of all, these are so grim, but it's, I think, nothing that is shocking, but it's very sad. But what I find interesting about this is kind of that argument of that quasi-autonomous seller, right? So it isn't a situation of outright trafficking. So then it says, like, she initially intended to work for only 3 months. And so I think that that's pretty universal of women who do enter it quasi-autonomously because of debt. And I know for myself, I said 2 months, that's all I'm going to do this for, just to get out of the red and back into the black. And then that ended up being 7 years for me and being swallowed up by sex work ideology. So I found that to be interesting because I think that that's a very common belief, is that you're just going to get so rich and, you know, it's going to fix all your problems in such a short period of time. And it really negates the issues that come about the longer that you're in prostitution, like the self-soothing that you get into and all that kind of stuff to endure it. And that extends your time in the industry. And then the other part here where it says, Yo said that the tea house owner hired 6 bodyguards. Really, those are enforcers, right? And we've talked about this extensively too, that who are they actually guarding? And they're actually guarding the interests of the business and the owner. And they're not actually there to protect women because they're not sitting in those rooms with them. And they are very unlikely to go after a sex buyer who would be violent because that's their customer base. So really, you know, I would say enforcers is more of an accurate term. Yeah, I don't have a ton of comments other than just it's very sad. And also, you know, her walking for days just to avoid being caught and taken back just shows the desperation of women to go to such extreme measures of risk that they will do that just to try to save themselves. It's just very sad.
This was before there was a highway system or high-speed rail.
So I have a few points to add. One was when it said the women were very aggressive in trying to get the men to pay. Like, you already gave that example from the man in the book where the woman said, please buy me, because otherwise what the other thing that'll happen will be worse. And I have read that many times, actually, when men in Germany review brothels, and sometimes they're reviewing them on Google Maps, not in the darknet, on Google Maps. They're writing, these women are so aggressive, they're always tugging on my arm, asking me to go up to the room. Yeah, it's going to be poverty or the pimp or addiction or a mix of all those breathing down her neck. It's not because she's enthusiastic. But it hurts his illusion that this is just a chill night out and this is like a consensual flirt or one-night stand. That's why they don't like the aggression. But you can understand it from the perspective of the women. The other part, the malnutrition. Malnutrition is still a real issue for women in modern German prostitution. There's a lot of people leeching on women in prostitution, and one of it is just the nearby fast food. I don't blame the individual fast food worker, of course, but a lot of those women are getting bad food or not enough food. And a lot of them are not, they're also dissociating all the time because of the unwanted sexual contact or whatever you want to call it. And if you're not feeling your body, you're also not going to be good at feeling your tiredness, exhaustion, pain, and hunger. So I have met a lot of prostitution survivors who struggle with food. IBS is very common too. This is explicit, but people need to know. Unwanted, repeated anal sex is bad for your bowels. And just trauma is bad for your entire reproductive system, digestive system, etc. The other part is the part about sanity. It said that women were driven into insanity. We have a huge problem with women who survive violent situations being called crazy and borderliners and menace to society because she's aggressive and difficult when she actually has raging PTSD. And so a lot of those women come out of prostitution, they're put in a psychiatric clinic, declared insane. That also hurts her if she's in court trying to take an abuser to court. They'll say, oh, she's a borderline or whatever. We don't believe her. So yeah, the sexual exploitation can, I mean, we know a lot of women are driven to suicide. It can break someone's psyche. When we say it's good for men's mental health, and all of us in this work know women who are no longer here or no longer here as healthy and present as they could be if this hadn't happened. And it just hurts to hear that because we don't go beyond stigma. We just say the stigma hurts, and the stigma does hurt. Of course, it's a big issue, but the fact that prostitution itself caused a lot of that trauma, we're still not willing to talk about it, even though that takes so much from women.
Now, before we get into the last article, I want to quickly talk about Jinmen or Kinmen, since the article is about a prostitute who was working there. While military brothels on Taiwan Island were phased out over the 1970s, the last military brothel operated in Jinmen until 1992, because until 1992, Jinmen was considered the front line of the ongoing Chinese Civil War and essentially treated like the DMZ in Korea. So civilians on Taiwan could not travel there. However, a system was set up so that there were 250 prostitutes there at any given time, all on 6-month contracts that could be renewed at the end of the term. And the average age of them was 23, and during the term of the contract, their food and clothes were provided by the military, and they got to keep 70% of what they make, work from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m., and then from 2 p.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, and they took every Monday off. And back in 1960, the military brothel tickets in Kinmen or Jinmen were divided into 3 tiers: officer for 25 New Taiwan dollars, sergeant for 20, and soldier for 10. And once again, on paper, they were women who willingly signed contracts. Many were, sold there by pimps, or they were caught for unlicensed prostitution in Taiwan and were forced by their pimps to enter these contracts. So yeah, we can start reading the article from 1960 about an unlicensed prostitute who ended up being sent to the front line in Kinmen.
Okay, so this article is called Exploring the Secrets of Military Paradise. Each female attendant has her own private room, varying in size and decor. Each room has a numbered green light above the door. When the light is on, it indicates that she is available. The doors are always closed. As we passed by the officers' section, we entered a room without a lit green light, room number 1X. Miss Jenjin from room number 1X was leaning against the headboard reading a novel. When she saw the manager bringing in guests, she quickly got up to greet us, her clothes still disheveled. While she was busy preparing tea, I took the opportunity to observe the decor of this small room. The most prominent feature was a large double bed, which took up almost a third of the room, covered with an exquisite straw mat. At the head of the bed were 2 embroidered pillows featuring mandarin ducks playing in the water. The novel she was reading, Debts of Emotion, was placed to the side, and the intricately folded quilt was draped diagonally across the bed. A pristine white linen mosquito net hung from silver hooks. Next to the bed was a wardrobe, on top of which were 2 leather suitcases and some shoe boxes. A small round table stood next to the wardrobe, surrounded by a few scattered chairs. The windows on the east and west sides were covered with thick blue curtains. The walls were adorned with colored photos of both local and foreign celebrities. Among these photos, the only one framed showed a high school girl in uniform with the emblem and insignia of X High School. Perhaps I was too absorbed in gazing at the photo of the schoolgirl, and I didn't even notice when Jen politely brought me a cup of tea. She then started a conversation. "Do you think that girl in the photo looks like me?" "Is she your sister? She looks a lot like you, but younger than me, right?" Of course, I was younger 2 years ago than I am now. She spoke nonchalantly, as if talking about someone else. "Oh, then why don't you continue your studies? It's surprising to see a high school educated girl in this line of work." "I'm sorry, Mr. Reporter, but I have no news for you and nothing to tell unless you want to hear a girl's complaints about reality. When I was 17, my father died and my mother fell ill from grief. My younger siblings were still small, so I had to drop out of school to work and support the family. My monthly salary of $300 wasn't enough to cover my mother's medical expenses. Relatives and friends distanced themselves from us, and my siblings were too hungry and dispirited to attend school. So I deceived my mother and secretly used the capital my parents gave me to earn money to treat my mother. Due to my young age and lack of experience, I was caught by the police and sent to Kinmen for unlicensed prostitution. However, most of the other sisters here voluntarily signed contracts. Whenever I am subjected to the desires of clients, I think about the devil's money I receive in return. So whenever I suffer, I console myself by thinking that enduring a moment of pain brings me a lot of money. Mr. Reporter, don't laugh at me for being materialistic, but money can cure my mother's illness, pay for my younger siblings' tuition, and most importantly, I can't easily earn this much money doing anything else. I have to send $2,000 home every month. In order to reach this amount, I try my best to satisfy the clients so that I can sell more tickets more easily. When I first arrived, I used to secretly shed tears in the quiet of the night, but later on, I got used to it. Maybe I became numb, and I don't cry often anymore. Moreover, the people who come to the military brothel are seeking pleasure. They usually have tense bodies and minds from drills, work, and combat. They hope to find relaxation and comfort here. How could I bear to let them feel the sorrow of my fate? People who come to the military brothels are from all ranks and branches. Soldiers go to the soldiers' sections, and officers have their own section. In our officers' section, most of the clients are junior officers. It's not that senior officers can't come. In room 1X next to mine, there's a colonel who comes every night without fail. Officers of colonel rank and above can go to the high-class section for entertainment. This is located in a Western-style building in Kinmen's Shijen village in New City, located in the 3 principles of the People Model County. Because the building is tall and frequented by high-ranking officers, it has earned the nickname high-class section. Officers who enter the high-class section don't necessarily have to buy entertainment tickets. They can also have tea parties, which means calling a girl to chat and flirt. A cup of tea costs 10 new Taiwan dollars, which buys 15 minutes of delightful company. The official cost of sexual services is 30 new Taiwan dollars, with tips being welcome. It is said that several high-ranking officers, including generals, often visit the high-class section, with colonels being the most frequent visitors, many of whom have wives and children at home. A colonel engaged in cultural work said, "As long as I don't neglect my family responsibilities, I see my occasional visits to the high-class section simply as indulging in some fun." In terms of age, those around 30 years old and unmarried visit the most, while Taiwanese, as opposed to mainlanders, officers in their 20s visit less frequently. Officers around 40 years old are regular visitors to the military brothels. Some enlightened unit commanders even encourage their subordinates to come here to satisfy their sexual urges in a proper manner. It is said that visiting the military brothels is also a valid reason for leave approval. I was so focused on listening to the stories of this remarkable woman who had experienced so much. I didn't notice when the manager brought steaming baskets of dumplings and a large bowl of braised dishes. An attendant had already set up 4 sets of bowls and chopsticks, insisting that we stay. We sat down with the manager to share the meal, and Zhenzhen and a civilian officer sitting on either side. Zhenzhen then took out the bottle of Kinmen Gaoliang liquor from the coffee table and said, "Good food with good wine. I hope Mr. Reporter and the civilian officer will drink to their heart's content." Zhenzhen placed a piece of poached chicken on my plate and said, "Do you like this chicken leg?" The civilian officer, who had been silent, also spoke up. "Stop worrying about how to write that article. Let's enjoy the wine tonight. Cheers." Well, my thoughts on the article is that there's a lot of things still that we see today. So when it said, it's surprising to see a high school educated girl in this line of work, that's the acknowledgement of the understanding of the vulnerability of women and girls in prostitution. And I would have sex buyers say that to me many times too. "You seem very well educated. What are you doing here?" You know, as if they knew that they were going to buy a woman from a lower socioeconomic level or lower level of education. So I found that was very telling. And then I also saw the part where she says, you know, "I think about the devil's money that I receive in return. And whenever I suffer, I console myself by thinking that enduring a moment of pain brings me a lot of money." So that again talks to that dissociation where, again, she mentions it and says, "When I first arrived, I used to secretly shed tears in the quiet of the night, but later on I got used to it." So that just talks about that numbing effect that we see occurring in prostitution. And I can speak to that myself as well. Like for the first couple months, it was horrific. And then after that, it was a shift in my mind that took me from a victim to a sex worker. And somehow that cognitive dissonance and that dissociation was, you know, not only a blessing, but then it also did end up being a curse because it keeps you trapped in that cycle of justifying what you're doing and rationalizing it or things that are being done to you. I think it just really shows that so much of what we see now, that understanding that these women are vulnerable and that they have to go into these, you know, alternative states of mind to survive it is universal.
I don't really have a lot to add, except she says pretty explicitly how she feels or hopes that what she does is good for the men. That's part of the coping mechanisms that we've been talking about throughout this. If you believe that the only thing you're achieving is male orgasms, like everyone needs to feel that what they do has meaning. That's completely understandable. So that women tell themselves, but I'm holding marriages together. That's a popular one. Or I'm even kind of being a sexual therapist. We already talked about the dangerous implications of that. It's totally understandable why the individual woman would tell herself that. But we as a society shouldn't accept that as a blanket statement and not question the implications or the situations that it arose in.
Right. So yeah, once again, thank you very much for coming onto my show, taking this much time out of your very busy schedules.
Yeah, thank you for all the research, because it sucks with the language barrier. I've always been interested in Southeast Asia, but I cannot read the original sources. It's good to have someone translate that, because otherwise the knowledge won't cross the language barrier.
Yeah, no problem at all. And if there's ever anything you need help with for your show, just let me know and I'll do what I can to help. And if there's ever anything you want my audience to know about, you're always welcome onto my show. Once again, thank you so much for recording this episode with me, and I wish you and your flourishing show continued success.
Thank you. We wish you all the best of success, too. It's really good.
Thank you, yes. We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.